Welcome back. I'm Melisa Idris. With me, anthropologist Dr. Joe Henrich, discussing the collective brain. Let's come back to what we were just discussing about in terms of how to make sure that we give equal access to the collective brain, making sure everyone benefits from the cultural learning. So do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you just said?
One of the things we know from studying cultural learning in children is that we have inclinations or biases to copy certain kinds of individuals. And two obvious ones that there's been a fair amount of work on are a tendency to copy those who match you on gender. So boys tend to copy boys, girls tend to copy girls. And people also tend to copy those who share their language, their dialect, and other ethnic cues. So that means if you want to inspire other members of a certain ethnic group or a certain gender to become inventors or become entrepreneurs, that you need to create role models that match the learners on these traits. Okay. So active policy interventions that make it more likely for someone, a woman say, to become an inventor means that you're going to create more female inventors in the future, because people tend to look to those who match them on these characteristics.
Okay, so
as a kind of thing I can do in life. Oh, that's one of the things women do, they're inventors.
So representation matters, of course.
Yes.
But this works both ways, doesn't it? So you kind of, because cultural learning is such, you learn the good and the bad. So when you have a good role model, you kind of model yourself after that. Does it also work the other way? You know?
Sure. If you're raised in a disadvantaged environment and the most successful folks around you are drug dealers or criminals or something, that seems like a sensible avenue to a young learner who's acquiring their notions of, like, what are the kinds of things a person like me can be.
Okay, so on that note then, how do we build social norms that are more, pro-social, pro-innovation, more inclusive?
Well, I mean, any kinds of norms that would promote these kind of role models, gender equality, interaction among ethnic groups, things like that are going to be the kinds of things.
So what are you
I'm not really a policy person.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, if you were advising policymakers about the collective brain, I think that's a lot of the conversation at the Khazanah Megatrends Forum has to do with that, this awareness of how the collective brain can be used to grow the country economically, through invention and technology, and also just social norms to make us think about where we're coming from and where we're heading. So what would you, advise policymakers to keep in mind when creating policy in perhaps a more inclusive Malaysia and a more inclusive world?
Well, a couple things. The first is to remember that people are really cultural learners and that they're using these cues to figure out who to learn from. So I mentioned the cues of gender and ethnicity, but another one is prestige. So if you want to get people to do stuff, if you can persuade the most prestigious members of the society to express those values or especially even demonstrate those values, then that can have a big effect.
Prestige.
So a classic thing that all philanthropists know, or that organizations that want to get philanthropy know, is that you get someone high status to make a big donation at the beginning of some banquet or something, and you're much more likely to get subsequent donations.
Oh, that works.
Yes, apparently that works.
Because we emulate.
We say, well, if if Beyonce is willing to make that donation, then I want to make that donation too.
Okay, all right, Joe. I want to talk to you a little bit about your next book, because I find it fascinating, and you've got the new book coming out soon, The Weirdest People in the World: How Westerners Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. So tell us about that.
So this began in 2010 when I was working with two cultural psychologists. And we began to gather all the data from psychology and other related fields like behavioral economics and to compare populations. And we found a great deal of diversity in people's individualism, willingness to trust strangers, analytic thinking, so thinking about categories instead of thinking more holistically, around the world in all these different domains. So what I've been working on for the last decade is trying to explain that variation. And in particular, European and European descent populations tend to be highly individualistic, particularly oriented toward trust and cooperation with strangers, but less concerned about family and kind of their local communities, and more inclined to this analytic thinking. More concerned about intentions, actually, too. And so this took me into trying to explain it, and I ended up reading a lot of European history and trying to develop some ideas around that.
Oh, and what did you find?
Well, the core of my idea is that one particular brand of Christianity, the one that evolved into the Roman Catholic Church, instituted a marriage and family program, which rather than having intensive kin groups where people marry their cousins and marry polygynously and own land corporately, it broke them down into individual monogamous nuclear families. And then people were unable to kind of reconstitute these large extended families, so they began to develop voluntary associations. So things like guilds and universities, and there were these charter towns in Europe where you could voluntarily enter the town and become a citizen of the town. And there was kind of a selection process. And so this created a different way of organizing social life, which then affected people's psychology. So one of the core ideas in the book is that our psychology responds to the institutions we're embedded in. So in a world where you're embedded in clans and tight families and lots of social obligations to your extended family, you tend to think about the world differently. You tend to think in terms of relationships. And this kind of small local group, that's where your loyalty is.
Right.
As opposed to a group where you're trying to find other people to build relationships with, and it could be strangers and whatnot.
So did that change throughout the years? I mean, throughout the generations? Because you talked about, you know, having small interconnected groups, but in generations to come, perhaps, you know, opening up of society means that you're looking at strangers more and building connections there.
Right, right. And so the idea is that if you're able to create this world where you can just go out and find strangers and make friends, go into business ventures, marry, all those kinds of things, you're creating a very different kind of world. And I make the case that this started in Europe, and then, you know, now it's globalization is very much that process.
Right. Okay. So are you planning to look at Asia, perhaps? You know, understanding how Asians are particularly psychologically peculiar and
well,
particularly
so in some of my so, you know, it's a global study, so I'm trying to explain global psychological variation.
Right.
And so in several of the chapters, I, you know, look at cross-country variation. In one of my studies, I compare different provinces in China. So China varies in the intensity of its kinship, not based on the church, the way Europe did, but there is some variation due to whether you did rice paddies or you did wheat farming. And so the ecology affects the intensity of these families. And so in the more rice-growing parts of China, there's more of this holistic psychology, more of clans, and kind of intensive kinship.
Well, what does the type of grain have to do with, what is the ecology?
Well, so for rice paddies, you need these large kin groups like clans in order to organize production. If you have wheat, a single person with oxen or different kinds of plow animals can plow it, and you can be more independent as a single nuclear household.
Amazing. All right, so I feel like we've covered the collective brain, and I guess I'm going to give you the last minute or so to kind of just give a message to Malaysians who are watching, and how we should be thinking about growing our collective brain, because it's not just coming from the top. It's not just policymakers and politicians who have a say in the collective brain. It's all of us that make it up. So if you could sum up your opening address at the Khazanah Megatrends Forum for us.
Well, the sort of shortest way to say it is it's better to be social than smart. And what that means is that if you increase the amount of social interconnections you have, you make your society much smarter as a group than if you increase its intelligence by an equal amount. In fact, in simple models, you can show that the effects of more social relationships have a much bigger effect on how innovative your society is than increasing everyone's IQ by an equal amount, an equal percentage.
So my takeaway would be to make sure that I am interconnected with my...
build trust. And it's also true as you as an individual, if you want to be innovative, you've got to connect with diverse people with different backgrounds than you and different ideas and different expertise. And that's the way you can be a more innovative individual.
But Joe, would you agree with me that we are in an age of a crisis of trust?
Yeah, so that's the big problem.
That's the big
so there's a lot of decline in trust, and so the key is to figure out how to increase trust.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me. It's been such a pleasure.
Great to be with you.
All right. I'm Melisa Idris, and I will be back with you on another episode on Astro AWANI. So I'll catch you then.